Let me welcome all of you. That means you have some seats, so you can move on the front seats. It's more convenient than the black seats. And it's a pleasure to welcome you at this session back to Modernity in the EU. I'm Patrick Messerlin. I'm a professor, emeritus professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Sciences Po is a university based in Paris, as I said. And this is really an excellent title. I suspect the title has been given 2 or 3 months ago, so before the Crimea event, before the Ukraine event. And the title, because of this recent event, the relationship between the EU and Russia, has taken a new turn. 2 months ago, certainly the focus would have been essentially on intra-EU issues, the social issues, whether we have gone too far in terms of integration, whether we did not pay enough attention to the concerns of the citizens, and we will have an election in 2 months at the European Parliament, where we expect to have some substantial numbers of members of the Parliament, European Parliament, who will be from extreme right, nationalists, and all these kind of political parties, anti-European or Eurosceptic parties. That was before Crimea and before Ukraine. And suddenly President Vladimir Putin told us that we are in the big world, we are not alone, and we have neighbors, and turbulent neighbors. And the Crimean War, I think, and the Crimean annexion by the Russia is really a game changer in the long run. There is no doubt about that, especially if it goes over eastern Ukraine and Ukraine altogether. Just for giving you a small trick of history, there was a Crimean War in 1860s between a coalition of French and British. I think this was the only time in the 19th centuries where you have a coalition of the French and the British against the Russians. And the Russians lost. And for President Putin, this coalition was certainly the worst of the EU. Britain is market-driven, and France is the idea about the EU as a big power. So in some sense, it was certainly a sweet revenge on this, this history. So the question now that comes to us, whether the EU wants to be a big, huge Switzerland and just say, no, the borders are here and we don't go further than that, or whether we have to think seriously about the counteraction, possibly military action, but also economic action. And by economic action, I don't mean necessarily sanction, and probably not sanction at all, because generally they are not very efficient. But I mean making improvement of the domestic internal market. For example, the energy internal market will be certainly a very serious blow to Gazprom monopoly from Russia. That said, we have an excellent panel to talk about all these issues. They have all the expertise that we need to cover the whole thing. Let me present the 3 panelists. Immediately on my left, Professor Kim Nam-Kook, who is a Professor Jean Monnet Chair at Korea University, which is based in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. And his main fields of interest are citizenship, human rights, all these issues that I was talking in the first part of my presentation. And he's also knowledgeable, very knowledgeable in terms of philosophical interpretation of public policy. So that's really one aspect. Then we have Mr. Kai-Olaf Lang, Dr. Kai-Olaf Lang, who is the head of the European Integration Unit at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, based in Berlin. And his field of expertise is Central and Eastern Europe and EU enlargement, basically. So we have the second aspect is also there. And then at the other extreme of the panelists is Dr. Stefan Niederhafner, who is a professor at Seoul National University in the Department of International Relations. And his field of expertise is governance in a multi-level systems, like the EU, which could be, the land, the federal government, and the EU level. So we have all the skills that we need to have an excellent session. And let me start by asking Professor Kim to give his first words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introductions. My name is Nam-Kook Kim at Korea Universities. I'm happy to deliver my opinions about the European situation here in Asan Plenum. My talk consists of a three-part. First is, what is the meaning of modernities? And the second, defining the EU as a typical modern project. And then I'll suggest two ways of a future of the EU. One is a Jean Monnet's way, which is to complete the EU integration as a modern project. The other is a Jan Zielonka's way, which is stop and retreat from the further integration of the EU and go back to the kind of medieval empire. When we say about modernities, the modernity is characterized at least the three factors. The first is invention of individuals. The second is a central role of a reason and science in problem solutions. And the third is emergence of a nation state as a dominant political entity. Modern era has started above all with the invention of individuals who has a belief in reason and science under the emergence of a nation state as the dominant political entities. The nation state solved the problem of a social integration through mobilization of ethnic nation and that of political legitimacy through establishing procedural democracy based on free and equal individuals. Despite its contribution to the achievement of a democracy, nation-state often worked as an exclusive mechanism and caused war of a fatal destruction in contemporary histories. So from the beginning, the European Union was the modern project, which aimed to contain people's fear of another war through planning of an institutional cooperation based on confidence of reason and the power of science. So we expect the evolution of the EU from modern power to a postmodern examples as a unique and exceptional international players. But that way will not be in the end of a unilateral future as this modern project assumes. Later, in the midst of the past, which goes far back to the medieval era of a plurilateral governance. So alongside the prolonged global economic crisis, opinion can be divided into two categories about the future of the EU. On the one hand, the necessity for the EU to retreat is emphasized since European integration has progressed too rapidly and deeply while ignoring differences among the member states. But on the other hand, the need to advance to a higher and deeper level of integration is asked for because the current crisis has stemmed from the incomplete integrations. The suggestion for a more complete integration, embracing the area of fiscal policies, is closely related to the ideas proposed by European elite, including Jean Monnet, at the initial stage of integrations. In the early 1950s, Europe, which had gone through the First and Second World War, perceived an urgent need to prevent another global war. To the people who emphasized with this sense of urgency and desperations, European integration meant, above all, an attempt to control the insanity and contingency which drive the humanity into the misery of war by means of the planning by a reason on the basis of trust and confidence in human rationalities. So in other words, European integration was convinced that the possibility of war, which inhere in the mind of human beings, could be restrained through the design by reason and institutional cooperation. They sought after the capacity of reason to control historic contingency and the establishment of the control tower based on capacities. By contrast, Jan Zielonka, a professor at the University of Oxford, exhibited a refuting argument against the proposition of a Monnet, which envisioned a complete integration of Europe as a unitary entity. By interpreting the development of the EU by the concept of a neo-medieval empire, Zielonka contrasts this characteristic against another image of Europe as a centralized state under the Westphalian systems. So the notion of neo-medieval empire is a concept that accounts for the reality of the EU, which has a horizontal and plurilateral governance system, and a blueprint that suggests the future direction of the EU. The expansion of government, So Xenophobia argues that this is the typical property of medieval times, characterized as a decentralization. In other words, the process of enlargement of border toward Eastern Europe, along with the unavoidable embracement or augment huge diversities, has transformed the EU as a revival of a neo-medieval configurations. With these contrasting viewpoints of Zhang Monet and Jan Zieronkas, when we say about the possibility of a collapse of the EU, we actually presuppose the assumption that the final goal of the European integration would be the establishment of a huge unitary state. Throughout history, however, all empires have very obscure or ambiguous fiscal boundaries. If the EU aims for a horizontal and plurilateral governance system under the competition and cooperation among multiple nation states, then the issue of collapse of the EU could not be raised in the first place. Here again, we should go back to the fundamental assumptions. The factor which determine the speed and level of integration eventually will be the citizens of the Europe who would step forward with voluntary participation and sufficient degree of solidarity in order to decide the destiny of a political communities. In other words, the most ultimate answer for this question could be provided from citizens of the EU. If there are no demos who could provide an answer to the question, then we would contend that it is necessary to gradually build up European citizens from now on. Nonetheless, European demos either non-existent yet or do not have solidarity to an extent to make a sacrifice of themselves for sharing responsibility for the failure of Southern Europe. So that is to say, the existence of citizens as the definite ground for legitimating all policy decisions at the current state of a crisis is doubtful. So the problem, after all, is again democracies.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lang?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm glad to share with you some views on where we stand in European integration at the moment, and I try to bind it back a little bit on the title of our panel, and that is the big question of if you're going back to the traditional modern situation if you're driven back to the modernity by the processes you're witnessing. I would like to touch upon three issue areas. The first one is, of course, what has been called the economic and financial crisis and the EU response. The second one is history and memories, and the third one is the foreign policy dimension exemplified by the Ukraine case. And it's basically three very contradictory observations which I would like to discuss with you on the crisis and the European response. In my opinion, if you look at the content of and the outcomes of the crisis management so far, this has been very much about establishing new elements of what has been called conditioned solidarity. So member states, especially those with financial troubles, have been encouraged or forced to do more consolidation efforts in their budgets, and in exchange for that, they got assistance and rescue packages. But what is more important in our context are the forms. How has this changed the modus operandi of the European Union? And I think we have two dimensions or two contradictory developments. On the one hand, we have more quasi-automatic rules. We have, for example, more consistent commitments to fiscal solidity, the so-called six-pack and other measures, new procedures, more consistent procedures to fight macroeconomic imbalances, additional attempt to debt reduction, and so on. And we also have first attempts to intensify economic policy coordination, like the European semester, country-specific recommendations for reforms, and so on. also, what is even more important, I think, we have a big stimulus for communitarization. I think even though some of the member states, including Germany, and the so-called countries from the New North, have dogmatically rejected the idea of introducing so-called euro bonds, so the mutualization, the formal mutualization of liabilities, I think de facto we have a high degree of mutual risks. If you look at the mechanisms we already have, the ESM, for example, the measures, the unconventional measures of the European Central Bank, the rescue packages, de facto we have a high degree of shared risk in the European Union. And we have something what I would call deepening in disguise. So on the one hand, we have these dynamic processes of more integration. On the other hand, if you look at the way it is done, we have a growing role of the European Summit, of the European Councils, the dynamics in the summits. I think the European Council is a sort of a European government, not the Commission, but the European Council. The member states have a growing role. We all remember the Merkozy times and the close coordination with Mr. Van Rompuy, and attempts of some member states to sideline the Commission. The German Chancellor, Mrs. Merkel, at some point called this new way, the attempt to rebalance the powers between the community institutions and the member states, the union method. And I think we also have new arrangements, contractual arrangements outside the treaties, and the most prominent example is certainly the fiscal compact, so satellite treaties which for various reasons are not directly part of the integration of the treaties. So what I would say, we have in this respect a strange coexistence of additional integration and additional member states' efforts to control the whole process and to give it political guidance. Second observation on history. I think in these months we are witnessing the strange ambivalence of history for the European project. History is a driver of integration, but history also is a source of tensions, which sometimes negatively interferes with the whole European process. And just one example for the sake of briefness. I think at the origins of the European communities was the Franco-German reconciliation. Germany, for various reasons, was interested in a sort of coming to terms with its own past, and a reconciliation policy with key partners. And this gave Germany more legitimacy and a very important resource for policy, not only in Europe, trust. And on the other hand, we had France and others who were interested in kind of containing Germany and erecting a system of interlocking governance. Now, what I observed after 2004, 2007, after the Eastern enlargement, some of the new member states contested what has been called the acquis historique of the European integration. So the assumption that it's basically the Franco-German myth of reconciliation which founded the European communities and the European integration. So they said, we have to diversify the European memory, and we have to bring in the experience of 4 decades of communism in Europe. And that was something what the European Union considered, for example, at the Berlin Declaration of 2007, taking into account a huge variety of values and experiences. But in the context of Ukraine, we see how different the memories and assessments are. Very last point on foreign policy and on Ukraine. I think what we see in Ukraine is I would call it an uncomfortable rendezvous of modernization and geopolitics. So the European project of reforms and transformation, the Brussels idea and philosophy of creating a win-win situation. So if Ukraine reforms, it's good for Ukraine, it's good for the EU, and in the long term it's also good for Russia. This clashes with the traditional idea of geopolitics, of power blocks, of spheres of influence, and with a modern concept of Russia, which Carl Schmitt, a German thinker, would have called the sovereignty of space. So we have a regional power, and this regional power has a specific zone of influence where outside powers and actors have only have no or very limited abilities to act. And I think now we see that the EU, and it has headache with that, discovers its role as a geopolitical player. I think for the first time in 2004, with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the EU was thrown into a geopolitical role in the post-Soviet space via Mr. Kwasniewski and Mr. Adamkus, the Polish and Lithuanian presidents, and Mr. Solana, the High Representative, at that time was had to be persuaded that he comes to Kiev. And much has changed in the meantime, and now the EU has not really a strategic concept, but a role. And this causes part of the troubles with Russia. To sum up, I would say, what does this all mean for European integration? Certainly, member states are back in, have a bigger role to play. Bilateral relations, minilateralisms in the EU are more important than in the past. And I think this will remain a big challenge for the next time. The management of bi- and multilateral relationships within the EU. But I would not say this is a big return to a Westphalian multipolar model. I would say in some we are witnessing the emergence of, I would call it, reinforced integration enriched by modest and cooperative neo-etatism. I think this is what is going on in the European Union in these years. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much, of course, for coming. I know the European subject might not be, especially given what is going on in East Asia, not the most urgent and current and important subject in the moment, but however, I really appreciate that we don't just discuss amongst each other here. I'm trying to connect a little bit with what the previous speaker said, and maybe I'm going to, or I will try also to push a few arguments which are already mentioned a little bit further. And I guess I'm probably not the only person which will kind of make this, let's say, a cheap joke, but I think, or I want to take the title of this conference and say it's not about back to history. Actually, I think, especially in the European Union, it's back to the future. And I'm trying to develop this now in a few steps. And I can kind of cut that short at some points because it was already mentioned by the previous speaker, some of these things. So first of all, I also want to mention, or I want to start with that actually if we look at the current crises and how they develop, how they unfold, then I think you can argue that in the end we will have a much more integrated European Union and a much more post-modern European Union in the sense as Professor Kim presented it just a few minutes ago. So, for example, starting with the Eurozone. Of course, there is still, like you can find opinions that the EU is faltering, that there is that you can see the disruption of the European Union, yeah, as the crisis unfolded and as one country after the other, especially in the south, tumbled into economic problems. But then on the other hand, if we look at where we are right now, then I want to agree with Professor Lang here, and again, yeah, push this a little bit further. Actually, I think we are already kind of, or not we, but the European Union is kind of out of that trouble. And actually what we see now is that there are certain mechanisms in place, few were already mentioned, which are kind of lifting the European integration, the quality of the cooperation, not in the whole, or not only in the Eurozone, but to some extent also the non-Eurozone countries are connected to this as well, which we didn't find before. And additionally to what was already mentioned, I want of course point out to the European Stability Mechanism, which is an internal IMF system, to put it like that, yeah, which will help to equalize or which will help to help countries which are in a debt crisis. And then on the other hand, we also have just recently a positive decision on the banking union, and I wrote it down somewhere. It's called the Single Resolution Mechanism, which is implementing a centralized oversight within the European structure, yeah, the European level, over the banks in Europe. This is also a quality of integration we didn't have before. And this is also, of course, a move away from the traditional nation state, yeah, which is controlling the issues within its borders, yeah, because again, a big shift of competences towards the European Union in the economic area. And we don't know if that will be enough to prevent future crises, of course. But on the other hand, we can see that it, for the moment, works, yeah, because Greece just placed a state bond on the financial markets, and it went surprisingly well. The next thing, and I know I jumped from one subject to the next, but I'm also picking up a little bit on what was delivered by the program, the rising nationalism. Of course, I also see the dangers here, and of course, in first place, because I do not really share these perspectives, to put it like that, I would wish that they don't gain any votes in the coming elections. But unfortunately, I fear it will be indeed the case, as Professor Messerlin already pointed out, that they win substantial, or at least much more votes than they did before. But also here, let me try to find, let's say, a bright future or a bright point. Maybe that is something like a incentive, much needed actually among the European national parties, because they basically, well, they do not really transport European issues, at least from my point of view, towards the citizens. They, and this is something which applies to all the nation states, I think, if something goes well, they claim the effort, they claim the success very much for them. If something goes wrong, they blame the European Union. I think to some extent the parties actually fail, yeah, to really connect the European citizens with the European level, to put it like that. And maybe seeing that if they don't do it, yeah, if the parties which are not supporting the, let's say, European enterprise, yeah, in a very general sense, if they are not doing that, then other parties seize the European subject, but in a way, yeah, which is very, very negative, then yeah, we will have the results we are facing, and that will maybe help them to turn towards modernity themselves, yeah, and transport, debate, discuss European issues much stronger than they did before. I also think that the Scottish referendum at the end of this year will change the picture, the one way or the other, to put it like that, because I'm pretty sure that it will lead also to a United Kingdom referendum. And I think also this will in the end help a little bit to get the road clear towards further and stronger and more political integration. I know I'm running out of time, but I also want to spend a few seconds, probably minutes, on the Crimea crisis, unavoidably. And I also agree that this is, of course, a big push, actually. Probably that was not really the intention of President Putin, yeah, but in the end it will be one of the strongest results, that he actually is delivering a very strong argument for further integration, especially in the security and defense area. I guess you all know that this is one of the most resilient areas in European integration. The nation states are very much insisting on their sovereignty in that regard, but it's quite clear, I would say, in the moment, to even the strongest defenders of national sovereignty, that the single countries in Europe are, in the moment, in no situation to kind of, let's say, in a classical Cold War, yeah, in a, let's say, historical sense, yeah, to deter Moscow from, well, basically anything. At least they were not able to deter Putin from seizing the Crimea Peninsula, and so there is no other way than to cooperate further. There is no way to integrate more, and I think this will also lead to substantial changes, and then of course to, again, a shift to a kind of post-modern structure, because I don't think that the European Union is actually developing into something like a true unitary state. I'm not convinced that the European Union is transforming into something like a classical federal state. I mean, then of course the problem arises, what is a classical federal state? Federal states look very much different from each other. They all have their specific histories, their specific methods, instruments, processes to deal with internal and external problems. So I'm pretty sure that the European Union have to develop its own way of doing things. If that will be the community method, yeah, or if the European Council will play a much stronger role in the future is something I don't know. Maybe we can also discuss this later, but I'm pretty sure that it will be some kind of post-modern European system of policy making. And I also think, this is maybe the last sentence, that of course also we have to kind of move away from, let's say, the classical or the modern ideal of a nation state if we discuss the future of the European Union, in the sense that we will not really have, from my perspective, we will not really have a coherent, cohesive European Union which is kind of resembling the classical idea of the nation state, yeah? That there is a clear external border, there is a clear definition who is a citizen, and there is a clear definition of who is controlling, well, let's say, the force or the means of force in this state. It will be a Europe of multi-speed. It will be a Europe of several borders. Yeah, we already have a Schengen area, we have the Eurozone, we have the political EU. They all are quite different from each other if you look into the details, and I guess this is something we will see in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. That was really a very interesting overview, starting from the medieval times to the coming back of the councils and the states more recently, and now the last step, which is in fact a very bizarre step, because at the same time that we have this Russian pressure, we have the British wondering whether they should leave or not, and whether they should secede between themselves. I have British friends telling me that London should think about seceding from UK, and this is not only the British. This is the same thing in Spain, in Italy. So you have a kind of decomposition of some member states in the current set of events. Now, if I may ask you to not only to react to your various statements, I would like also to ask all of you one question, which I think is a really interesting question in this Ukraine affair, because I think Ukraine is really a turning point for us, externally and internally. We have made, this is my point of view, so please, of course, discuss that. We have made a big mistake, because in some sense we have used the traditional EU enlargement policy, which was pretty crude, to be honest. It was consisting essentially in telling the country partner with us, this is the rule of book in Brussels, you just adopt that, all this 1,000 page as quickly as possible, and you will get a nice treatment. When we did that with Georgia or with Moldova, nobody really cares, although Russia was becoming a little bit nervous. When we did that with Ukraine, it was seen by Moscow as really an annexation of Ukraine by the EU. And I have gone through the 1990s, and to be frank, we have in some sense been very difficult partners to the Central European countries, because we told them, you do that, you do that, you do that, you do that. Just to give you an anecdote, I participated to one of these meetings with the EU 15 and the European Central Member States, candidate to become member states, and it was in the huge room of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the pact, the military pact between Soviet Union and the Central and Poland and all this stuff. So it was in this huge room, and there was a silence in the room, and I asked all the Central Europeans, Estonians, Poles, etc., why are you so silent? And they told me the Commission has taken the seats of the Soviet marshals. So, you know, you could see immediately the shift from Moscow to Brussels in 1 year, something like that, in a couple of years. So my question is, finally, this game now is crumbling down, and that's, of course, difficult for Ukraine, it's difficult for us, and that will certainly reshape the various arguments that you have provided. In which direction, that basically. So it interact with you, and in which direction your argument will be reshaped by this failure in Ukraine, because I think we can already talk about the failure in Ukraine.
Yeah, as he introduced, and at the beginning of these sessions, I'm basically political philosophy major, political scientist, and many times I try to raise a more fundamental questions to think about the situation, hopefully more fundamentalist. And I absolutely agree with the Professor Lang's and the description about those uncomfortable scene of a geopolitics. As we come back, we want to now see the clash of a traditional kind of geopolitics, and also the challenge of a modern sovereignty among the nation state. But let me ask again, why should it be a further integrations to solve the crisis, the current crisis in the Ukraine? And again, let me ask, what happens after those crises are over? What is the purpose of a integration? Integration for the sake of integration, and many times. Of course, so far, those integration is mainly based on those economic benefits. And then since 1992, now it's turned to a political community. And previously, those customers want to be changed into a citizens, right? But there's no citizens. And the European Union want to invent those citizens through many kind of the programs to justify the Brussels kind of the decision making. And again, it's not easy kind of the situation, like prioritizing those military tasks or military role of the EU demand a clear definition of a two dimensions. First is a security of the European internal space. European Union should define what is the matter, or the critical matter, or critical kind of subject of a security of the European internal space. And then what is the other is what is the kind of the humanitarian values and the enemies abroad. Right? Those two kind of spaces it should define. But drawing those explicit European space is not easy task. And then if you reach a consensus about such a space, I think in the meantime those 28, the member state, I mean before reaching those consensus, they collapse, right? Or they break down among those different interests. Those are the 28 member states. So the crisis on the European integration or further integration, what the future kind of EU is I mean it's totally different kind of the task well, would be different kind of topics. If it is, say, exactly the traditional geopolitics or challenge of a modern sovereignty among the member states, then it should be solved in that way. Why try to override dominantly or override absolutely remove those influence of Russia in that you should coexist, right, among the nation state if it is a traditional challenge of the traditional sovereignty. I'd rather stop and then back to after you give it another chance. Right?
You want to go?
Yeah, you were asking the big question. Was it a fundamental mistake on the part of the EU to copy the principles of enlargement? If someone from Poland or Latvia would sit on this panel, he would ask just the other way around. He would ask, wasn't it the fundamental mistake that the EU did not offer Ukraine a copy of enlargement or enlargement in itself? I think we have to take into account two factors in this game. The one thing is what kind of change does the EU want to achieve in its neighborhood? And I think it's very, very easy in principal ways. The EU, just like any other regional power, wants its neighborhood to look like itself does, in terms of its economic system, in terms of the political system, and in terms of the values which are dominating there. So the EU tries to do a sort of soft convergence policy or homogenization of its neighborhoods. How can we achieve that? I mean, the traditional formula of the enlargement was the core incentive we have is not only to be like us, but to be us, to become part of us. And in exchange, you have to do some reforms. In exchange for that, you get the incentives of participating in the common market and, of course, participating in the regional and structural policy schemes, and so on and so forth. This was possible in Central Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe because there was a consensus of elites. I would even say before there was a palpable membership prospect, because it took us quite a long time in the EU to have a consensus about this. Even before that, in countries like Poland or Hungary, there was a clear agreement within the elites and societies that those nations should correct a historical anomaly, i.e. being part of the East. They wanted to get back to the West, and that's why people more or less supported economic reforms, the social costs of it, and the political transition. So, for example, the Balcerowicz plan, so the shock therapy in Poland, took place way before there was a sort of a practical or palpable EU prospect. And that's a difference, I think, a fundamental difference to Ukraine. And I think here you're very right. There was no pro-Western consensus, and there is no Western consensus in Ukraine. When Mr. Kuchma, the former president of Ukraine, tried to make Ukraine a swing state. So once we cooperate with the West, once with the East, and that's the best situation we have. And now Ukraine, and I think it will remain, Ukraine is something in a gray zone, and it might be a buffer. The question is, will it be a stable buffer or an unstable buffer? So I think Ukrainians have to know what they want. And that's the second dimension. That's the foreign policy and security policy context. And here I would slightly disagree with what was implicitly in your question, I think. What is in the EU's interest, apart from creating convergence and exporting stability? I think even a level lower, the core interest of the EU is our neighbors, basically everyone in the international system, but especially our direct neighbors, should have a right to decide about their geopolitical orientation. Here comes Russia in the game. I think from the moment when the EU launched its new Eastern policies as an effect of the eastward enlargement, because our borders moved to the east, and we now are direct neighbors of Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and others. From the very moment of launching it, there was this attempt to include Russia in some way. The first ideas from Brussels, conceptual ideas of what was later called European neighborhood policy, they were called Wider Europe. And they were about the so-called 3 Eastern European newly independent states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, and Russia. And then it decoupled. And the culmination was the launch of the Eastern Partnership, so a new cooperative framework for Eastern European neighbors and Southern Caucasus countries. And at that time, Russians were talking about Eastern Partnership, sometimes joking. That's bumagi. In Russian, that means documents, because that's the first letters of the countries that it is about, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and so on. So it's just papers. And then Russia realized that the EU's engagement has substance, or might have substance. And that was the moment when this kind of competition of integration arose. I think for the first time in a very substantial way, maybe in spring 2009, when the EU offered a financial aid package to Ukraine for modernizing the gas transport grid. And Russia said, it's not possible that the consumer and the transit country cooperate without the producer. I think there is some truth in that. But in 2009 also, when the Eastern Partnership was launched at the Prague summit, the EU said, we cooperate with our Eastern partners, but Russia has a possibility to join on a project base. Now, obviously, this did not work. And now the question is, do we want a trilateral arrangement, EU, Russia, plus Ukraine? Or do we say we have 2 vectors of cooperation, EU-Russia relations and EU-Ukraine relations? And here we see, I think, the conflict between the member states, those who traditionally follow a Russia-first approach, and those who have a Ukraine-first approach, trying to contain Russia by creating a ring of friends around Russia. So I think this is very much the question. I would say Russia should be included, but should not be given a droit de regard, so an effective veto power about co-deciding about Ukraine's future. And I think this is the tricky situation with the Lavrov-Kerry memorandum and the Geneva talks. The federalization of Ukraine. At first glance, why not? But I think the intention behind this is to establish an institutional structure which would create leverage to block Ukraine's approximation with the EU. So I think the scenario which might come out of that is not a Finland, not a new Finland in the east of the EU. That is a country which is neutral in terms of its foreign policy and security orientation, but a new Bosnia-Herzegovina. So with eastern parts of Ukraine as something like Republika Srpska, so a quasi-federative unit which is not controlled by Kiev, but which has a veto power vis-à-vis Kiev. Very last sentence. I think Russia's behavior is very much motivated also, but on the one hand by these strategic things, on the other hand by a new domestic momentum. And if you look at the opinion polls, Vladimir Putin's popularity has gone up increasingly. And I recently read an article by a Russian scholar who said, who kind of had an argument with the old Brzezinski-Kwasniewski thesis that Russia with Ukraine is an empire and Russia without Ukraine is a big country. And he said that's not true. He said Russia was an empire in history, also at some times without Ukraine. But Russia without Ukraine cannot be Russia. So, which means that kind of Ukraine is part of the Russian identity and the Russian national self-definition. So that makes it, of course, very difficult to cooperate in a constructive way. The bottom line is, I think, and here I would be more pessimistic than you, I think Ukraine will not be a push for a positive stimulus for Europe's foreign policy. I think the divisions have been visible and will be even more visible about Ukraine. And it has revitalized the American vector in parts of the European member states, the Baltic states, Poland, which have Europeanized insecurity in the last years very much, especially with the Obama administration, now looks again much more intensively to Washington with missile defenses, American boots on the ground as an objective, whereas others are much more reluctant. I think the stimulus in your sense, well, in the way in your vein, would be internally, as just like the 2008-2009 gas crisis between Russia and Ukraine, which led to enormous shortages in Slovakia, Bulgaria, and other member states, has improved energy infrastructure, energy security in these member states. Just the new Ukraine crisis will also be an additional momentum, for example, creating an efficient European energy market and having new mechanisms of energy solidarity. Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, a lot of very interesting points. I try to get back to your initial question about the impact of this crisis on European integration and to connect with your last statement, because, yeah, so far we didn't actually mention energy at all. And I think this is, of course, obviously one of the sectors where the Crimea crisis will have a very strong and probably the most profound effect. So if I just can connect to that, actually I would not be that positive about the development of the, well, let's say gas pipeline system or the general energy system in the European Union, because I can't really see a big enhancement between 2009 and now. Yeah, as you said, already in 2009 it was like by shock. Yeah, the European Union learned, especially the southern eastern members, how dependent they are actually on the Russian gas. And what was done? Well, Germany was pushing for a direct connection, yeah, via the Nord Stream with the Russian gas supply. And not much was done in the southern area, and this bites back now. The Bulgaria, Romania, and so on, they start pushing for the South Stream, yeah, like the equivalent. But then, of course, having the Crimea crisis at hand, what does this actually help us? Yeah? Help the European Union, because neither the North nor the South Stream does help the European Union in terms of energy security vis-à-vis Russia. Yeah? Both is actually just a pipeline towards the, so you cut out the middleman, you cut out the Ukraine, but nothing is done, yeah, in terms of dependency from Russia. And this is, of course, something I assume is learned now. Yeah? It was not learned 2009, but I guess there will be a lot of effort done in the energy field to get, first of all, firstly, independent from Russia, yeah, like tapping better in the African or in the global liquid gas market, for example. Maybe the Nabucco pipeline, yeah, which was kind of independent from Russia. Yeah, the Nabucco, I guess you know that, was not or is tapping directly into other Central Asian gas fields. So that will come up on the table again, I think. And then, of course, in the long run, I think also renewables. Yeah, just getting independent from oil and energy. The renewable energy sector will also get a strong boost. And I'm not expecting that this will just done on the national level. This will, of course, require European solutions. And Lisbon already had the first very weak, yeah, competence for the European level. And I guess the next treaty will have a much stronger energy sector component. And connecting, if I may, connecting that with the security question again, I think especially in that area, but not only in that area, you can see the, well, the point I try to make for a further integration. If you want to realize these kind of projects, then in Europe you need cooperation. Because first of all, by a look at the map, there are always several countries involved. Yeah, so you need a kind of regional cooperation to realize these projects. The European framework of decision making is already there, so it's kind of natural to use that. And again, yeah, there are already competences. There is a EU energy commissioner, yeah? Maybe not the most active one, to put it like that, but nevertheless the office is created. Yeah? And then of course also dealing with Russia, whatever happens to Ukraine, dealing with Russia will be always, let's say, suboptimal from a European perspective as long as the nation states do that in a bilateral way. Yeah? Germany is satisfied as long as Nord Stream works, yeah, but what happens to the other countries which are totally dependent? And then also this is not just Southeast Europe, yeah? You mentioned Finland. Finland is 100% dependent on the Russian gas, yeah? So it's also not that you have a north-south divide that easily, yeah, or that clear. So the picture is a little bit more fuzzy, and in the end, again, I think the only solution, yeah, which can help there is a further integration. Then the last thing about the future of the Ukraine. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not a prophet. Yeah, so I'm not sure what's going to happen to Ukraine. I hope it will be as peaceful as possible. Yeah, but I think the federal solution is maybe the only one we can actually seriously discuss right now. Yeah? I fear that maybe a Balkanization is basically well, unavoidably, just to create what you mentioned before, just to create this buffer between Russia and the European Union, and to respect also what you mentioned before, to respect the borders, yeah, the empire sphere, yeah, of Russia, where the Russians do not want, first of all, a direct NATO, a direct European influence, and second, of course, we should not forget, of course, also the NATO question plays a big role here. Yeah, Russia made clear that the NATO should stay in the borders where it is right now and not go further. And so we kind of, or the European Union missed the chance to create agreement with Ukraine, which allowed Russia to participate. It's also something you mentioned already before, and I think also there I would kind of be, or I like to go a little bit further. I think it was a mistake to, again, try to do it in, let's say, the classical style. Yeah, you are either within the European Union and within the European customs zone, or you are with Russia. And inside the, I mean, they have a free trade agreement with Russia, yeah? So it was, the European Union said, Ukraine, you have to opt out, yeah? And that was the point where the Russians really got, how to say that, yeah? Where they really start worrying about what's happening in the Ukraine, to put it at that point. Would the European Union have chosen, I know, last sentence, would the European Union have chosen an approach where Russia would have been integrated, where Russia would have been allowed to sit at the table and negotiate possible economic and security and whatever treaties of the Ukraine with both partners? We would probably not be in the situation we would be right now. But that is, of course, hindsight, guessing, yeah, and in hindsight, everybody knows it better.
Okay, maybe it's time now to give the floor a chance to raise questions. So please, two gentlemen here at the forefront, and there's a mic, and somebody here.
I'm afraid that the question I'm going to ask may deviate a little from the focus of today's discussion. But Professor Lang made a reference to Franco-German reconciliation in your presentation. And I think Franco-German reconciliation and cooperation is indeed the driving force behind European integration. And this And one of the contributing factors to Franco-German reconciliation was the well-known friendship between Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer was basically a man of European culture and a Francophile. But as you know, we are undergoing a very difficult period in Korean-Japanese relations. I wonder whether you are aware of the recent developments in Korean-Japanese bilateral relations, which are made difficult mainly because of Japan's reluctance to admit squarely the war crimes that it committed, including the mobilization of Korean women as sex slaves. But and the example of German Franco-German reconciliation is often cited in discussing the current Korean-Japanese relations because we highly value Germany's attitude in admitting its wartime crimes. Last year, for example, German President Gaduc, he visited a small French village during his state visit to France to apologize once again for the war crimes that Germany committed during World War II. So in this connection, do you have any advice or comments to offer for Korean and Japanese leaders?
Okay, sir. We take a couple of questions, then you react to several questions.
Thank you, Professor Kim Nam-Sik. I would like to make a short comment. It's about the Korean affairs. I don't understand why the EU could not have dispatched peacekeeping force at the time of Korean integration by Putin. As far as I know, the EU could not effectively stand up to the Putin's strategic counter with strategic maneuvering toward the Crimean affairs. As you know, the EU has a European Commission, European Council, and a High Representative of CFSP, and also ESDP. CFSP and ESDP both have failed, completely failed, I would say, in the case of a Crimean crisis. I hopefully expected that the EU should have dispatched the decent size of peacekeeping forces there to counter or discourage Crimean integration into Russia by Putin. What do you think about these two, Professor Nam and Professor Long? That's all.
Maybe a third question, and then quick answer, please, and then a second round of questions if we have time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is regarding the enlargement of
your
the
affiliation,
European...
please.
Pardon?
Your affiliation, please.
Yeah, I'm Gitanjali. I'm from the Observer Research Foundation from New Delhi, India. And this is regarding the European Union enlargement. Even as we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the enlargement, when many countries joined the Union 10 years ago, I was wondering, we've reached a stage where many countries which were clamoring to join the Eurozone, namely Czech Republic, Poland, maybe even Turkey, have now, have second thoughts, on joining the Eurozone, because many countries, as we all know, are struggling to stay afloat. So what are your views on what is going to be the future of the Eurozone? And I'm sorry because I'm asking this question because I'm an economist and I'm more interested in the economic
Not
angle.
apologize to be an economist.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's a respectable...
Thanks.
I am an economist. Okay, please. answer the three questions as you wish in the order. Do you want to start? Or let's start from the other hand, and then you will go in the other direction.
Yes.
Okay, so please.
Okay, yeah.
But quickly, yeah, because we have...
very quickly, okay, I try.
Yeah.
Well, then let me just start with the last question, I guess. Well, in the moment, the problem, or the biggest problem I fear, or I think, is that you can't really sell the joining or the acceptance of the euro to a domestic population in general. Definitely not in the United Kingdom, but also in other countries, yeah, as you mentioned, yeah, which are also, they don't have a choice basically, yeah, they have to join when these states joined the European Union in 2004. They signed basically that they will, as soon as the benchmarks are met, that they will join the eurozone. So that's not actually optional. However, again, yeah, the moment is probably not the best, yeah, because of all the discussion and especially the negative discussion about the euro and the crisis. But then I guess if things calm down, you already, I guess you realize that I'm quite optimistic about the future development. So if things calm down, I'm pretty sure that more states will join, and that this is also pretty well acceptable to these states. Yeah, and I leave it here, and hopefully we can have more distinctive opinions from the other speakers. Well, and then again, I'm not really a security specialist, but however, I mean the question that the European Union would dispatch peace forces to the Crimea Peninsula has, I mean, I just want to mention 3 or 4 points. First of all, of course, the dispatching of peace troops is UN business. So you would need a UN Council decision. On the Security Council is Russia, so that's it. You don't send peace troops to the Crimea, which is, of course, also one of the problems in the moment. Yeah, well, okay, that was... Yeah, I just wanted to mention the UN so that we have everything on the table. And then... Yeah. Well, but the common... Yeah, but there is the policies, but if you look a little bit further into the details, you realize that there is actually not really an army. And if you want to deploy troops, you have to have a European Council decision. And then we have again the problem which was already mentioned, that we don't have a common consensus about among the member states how to deal with Russia. Yeah, there are distinctive, very, very different positions. The United Kingdom has a very different position from the Germans. The Germans have a very different position from what the Baltic and the Polish states think about what you should do vis-à-vis Russia. And then last but not least, neither of these states does want to send troops to start shooting at potentially shooting at Russians, yeah, which is, of course, a serious possibility if you would send troops there. Let me add a few one sentence more on the Crimea subject, because it was mentioned before already. I mean, I don't want to defend what the Russians are doing there. Yeah, I'm not a fan. I'm just kind of stating the obvious. Yeah, if you look at how many harbors, ports Russia has, which are securely ice-free for the whole year, there are actually not that many. And you can see that, you know, under no circumstances the Russians would let Sevastopol go. Point. I mean, again, I'm not a security specialist, but that's basically what they will tell you, and I leave it here.
Dr. Lang?
Eurozone enlargement. I think the Eurozone is interested in bringing in new members because it is a sign that the monetary union is alive and kicking. So it's a sort of attractiveness. But it's only at the moment interested in having new members which are in scope and weight relatively limited, i.e. Lithuania as the next one is digestible with no major risks, whereas Poland or even the Czech Republic is a completely different weight class. And I think if I look at the discussions between Germany and Poland on this case, Poland says we want to join. That's our manifest political objective. And in Poland, it's mainly a political debate. It's about belonging to the political center of gravity of European integration. We want to join, but first of all, the Eurozone has to be stable. And Germans and others say, we want you to have inside, but don't hurry. So basically, that's the situation. On Ukraine, I think that there was, on the part of many member states, indeed a certain fear that this could lead to a militarization of the EU-Russia conflict. And of course, you could have thought about the unilateral scenario, not in the EU framework, but let's say in the French style and Northern Africa or Central Africa or wherever. So a group of member states. I mean, basically what he's also telling is the only success, I would agree with your sober assessment of the EU's track record in the Ukraine crisis, the only success the EU had was the Weimar Triangle, the French, German and Polish foreign ministers going to Kiev and hammering out a compromise, which was not very enduring. However, it played, I think, an important role at one moment. So, but then again, which member states would have taken the risks of doing that? Because I think there was a consensus in the EU that we should be very reluctant because we are a party of the game. So on the one hand we have the EU, and on the other hand we had Russia. So there was a preference for doing it, for example, in the OSCE framework. And then Franco-German reconciliation. I think the analogy is rather Germany and Poland. Also because of the way of the things which happened in the Second World War. And my assessment is there have been three key elements which have been furthering cooperation and have led to a certain flourishing of German-Polish relations after 1989. The first one, and that's something you don't have here, unfortunately, the Polish former Foreign Minister Skubiszewski, at the beginning of the 1990s, was talking about the community of interest between Germany and Poland. And I think the hardcore of this community of interests was both countries wanted the EU enlargement. Germany wanted Poland in the EU, and the EU and Poland wanted to join. So Germany was Poland's most powerful advocate. Second factor, we managed to have a diversification of cooperation. So of course, we have the political level, which is highly volatile, or which has been volatile, or which was volatile. We also have very tight economic contacts. We have civil society contacts, transporter cooperation, and so on and so forth. And this made it more robust. And then, and that's kind of the political part, both countries managed to establish, I would call it, an infrastructure of cooperation and reconciliation, which was buttressing the whole process. For example, we have a German-Polish Foundation for Cooperation. This is a special fund which was financed at the beginning of the 90s from money, basically from old debts Poland would have to pay to Germany, but the German government said, no, you don't have to pay, and part of the money went into this common foundation, which supports projects between civil societies and others. So the precondition, I think, for everything is, of course, an intrinsic process in the country of the perpetrators. And I remember a discussion about forced slave labors and compensation payments between Germany and Poland some years ago. And at that time, and I took part in a discussion where Mr. Genscher was, the former German foreign minister. And some people said, you have to force it upon Germany if the German government doesn't want to do it. And then Genscher said in a very important sentence that you cannot force a gesture. It is a gesture, it's our German gesture, and it's a signal. And it's not something which you can force upon us. It has to be a voluntary gesture. And at the end, it was done, and I think this was a positive contribution.
Professor Kim, please.
Okay, thank you. So, briefly, I mentioned those Professor Hurst and Professor Lang's the questions and mentioning. Of course, the Ukrainian situations, it will be a getting rid of the buffer zone between those Europe and Asia. So it could be bring about a new kind of totally different change situations, which eventually change the shape of the EU. And certainly, the EU cannot dispatch the forces into Ukraine, and I think their review is a failure. And then, in reality, those crises would be the kind of impetus to develop fastly and into a more military and security dimensions. But in doing so, we should very careful. As I mentioned earlier, it's not easy to define those inner and outer space for the European Union's the security tasks. And secondly, EU would lost a fair third-party images. It's really important kind of the power, so-called the soft power that the EU established during last 60 years, despite it cannot be the huge military power. Right? And thirdly, it's very interesting. EU already spent a lot of money to manage such neighborhood policies, not to mention those military spendings, and but also the civilian kind of reconstructions. If you combine those military spending and civilian reconstruction costs, I think it will outdate, or it will outweigh the EU and the American spendings. So we should consider these kind of three aspects when you push those EU to be the military kind of security international players. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was an excellent panel, and we could continue, of course. So let's give a round of applause to everybody.